Welcome friends to Walking the Theosophical Path. We will start this series examining an article by Blavatsky, but also complementing what she says with other authors. But before we start, let me explain for those who are new how this webinar works. So normally what we do is to look at some theory, some part of the teachings from a theoretical point of view, which is a foundation for our practice. And then at the end of the meeting or after the meeting, I send an exercise for us to do during the week. And then you can send me an email with your experience with the exercise, or you can also share it here by means of the chat box or using the microphone also. If you send me an email, I normally read the email anonymously so that you feel free to share. Sometimes there are personal aspects in the exercise. The idea is that all these exercises will have to help us in our real life, in the real situations that we face in our lives. So it is perfectly fine to bring up, whatever situation you try to apply the exercise to. And then at the next meeting, we spend the first time of the meeting to discuss the experience. Now take advantage of the format of this so that you also can share in what ways or for what reason you couldn't do the exercise. This is not something that we have to tell stories of success with the exercise. The idea is that this can help you try to practice, and whenever there are obstacles, we have to look at the obstacles and try to see if we find a way to deal with them. So don't be shy of sending the experience, even if it is I couldn't remember through the week. That's something very common, and there are things that we can do to help with that. So just be comfortable saying that. And also remember that we are all coming from different places. Some people have been doing this for years, decades. Other people are just beginning. So never compare your experience to others. I mean, you can learn from everybody, but then each of us is at the particular moment in which we are. And then at the end of the meeting, Jim leads a meditation, because it's, this is obviously part of the spiritual practice, but also doing a meditation after having put our minds for quite a bit of time on the spiritual aspects can help you reach deeper states in your meditation. So if you want to learn how to meditate or to get into the practice, these are great opportunities for you to start getting a sense of the meditation. Today will be a little unusual in the sense that we don't have the sharing of the exercise at the beginning. So I will take a little longer for the theory than I usually do. All of these are recorded so that you can watch them again if you need to, or you can, if you cannot participate live, you can watch it at home. And then since you can participate, you can share your exercise by email, then whether you can participate live or not, you can still have your voice in the program, because I can read your experience and make comments on it. Okay, so let us start. Blavatsky starts by saying that whatever differences are to be found in the various presentations of the esoteric doctrine, yet in every one of them we find the fullest agreement upon one point: the road to spiritual development. let's pause here. The idea is that she's referring to the esoteric doctrine here. So it's not necessarily referring to religions as such. The idea that Blavatsky proposes is that religions are partial expressions of the esoteric doctrine. The theosophical teachings also are partial expressions of the esoteric doctrine. But whenever the expression, that partial expression in a religion or in a philosophy, in the theosophical teachings, whenever that expression is has not been distorted or changed throughout time, she says, no matter what the particular approach is, there is something in which all of them coincide, all of them agree. So you know that we have different approaches. There are approaches that are more devotional, others are more intellectual, others are more practical, and within these there are differences also. So there are different paths because there are different people, and normally the theosophical approach encourages us to use tools from all the different paths. Of course, we may have more affinity with one in particular, and that's natural because our personality itself is a limited expression of the real. So being limited, it cannot respond fully to everything. However, the idea is that all the different paths have things that we can incorporate and that help us grow in a more holistic way. So you know that if a person is very intellectual, there is the tendency to lose the ability to produce or to do practical things, or there is the tendency to lose the ability to feel. We see this, with scientists. Of course, this is just a generalization, but I think we can see that very intellectual people may have these tendencies, and the same may happen with the spiritual life. So even though a person may have an intellectual tendency, working with a more practical aspect, bringing in a devotional aspect, will help balance the approach, because eventually we want to get to a state that transcends the intellect or the emotion or the action. So the balancing out of all the different elements, it helps us not to get stuck in a particular approach. The same can be said with devotion. If a person is devotional but it does not try to balance that to some extent, at least, with a certain level of intellectual understanding or a practical engagement with life, also that person may fall into extremes of emotionalism, etc. So the idea is that all paths are limited, and although we will almost inevitably feel more comfortable with one approach, it's good to incorporate elements from the others. So in any case, Blavatsky says whatever the method that is used, there is something in which, according to her, all of the teachings coming from the esoteric doctrine in all its different manifestations, they all agree, and that is the road to spiritual development. And then she focuses on one aspect in particular. She's talking in a general way. She's not talking about the methods, but the spirit. What is it that will take us to develop spiritually? And she says, one only inflexible rule has been ever binding upon the neophyte, as it is binding now, the complete subjugation of the lower nature by the higher. So this is what we are going to spend some time today to understand what this means. We can put it in different ways. This is the language that Blavatsky chose. But here there is the idea that there are two aspects to our nature, what she calls the higher and the lower nature, which we will explore. And there is the idea of the complete subjugation of the higher or of the lower by the higher. So we will see what that means. Before that, let us look a little into the human constitution, the higher and lower nature. Many of you may be familiar with this, but others may not. So we need to understand what we mean by the higher and the lower nature. We can start from the typical triple classification of what a human being is. Spirit, soul, and body. This was part of the early Christian tradition. Later on, spirit and soul got kind of confused. They seem to be more or less the same. So today Christianity tends to have more of a dual conception of a human being, spirit and body, or soul and body, which can match more or less the idea of higher and lower nature, although we will see this in more detail. But originally, St. Paul, for example, talks about these three aspects. And the idea is that, well, the body is, we all know, the physical aspect of ourselves. Although also in early Christianity, they had the idea of a body that had its own desires, the desires of the flesh. They were part of something that came from the body. So the body in early Christianity would be the body plus the biological tendencies, the instincts, the tendency to run after pleasure and run away from pain, the tendency to preserve itself and to defend itself or to attack when there is a sense of threat. And all these biological tendencies, all that would be part of the body in early Christianity. Then we have the soul, which the soul can be corrupted and therefore, go to hell in the typical Christian view, or that soul can be made divine and then go to heaven. But then there was this idea of the spirit, that the spirit was an aspect of ourselves that was incorruptible. It is, I think, because I haven't seen a lot of descriptions of what the difference is, but many Christian mystics would say that at the bottom of the soul, in its innermost aspect, its most essential aspect, there is the presence of God. So the spirit was like the presence of God, and it was incorruptible. The mystics also would talk about the Godhead, which some people think it came from the idea of the godhood. You have the God, which is a limited manifestation of something higher, that is this godhood, this essence, impersonal, omnipresent essence. So we could say that this spirit is that more abstract aspect of the soul, the impersonal aspect. In any case, we can talk about these three levels of the human being. And according to the Theosophical teachings, we can see different aspects within these three. For the spirit is the source of everything, so that is, homogeneous, that is one, that is the unity behind everything. But then there are three aspects for the soul. As we can see, there are here three aspects that we are going to explore for the soul. The spirit in general in theosophical literature is seen or talked about with the Sanskrit word Atman, which means self. Self in the sense of a universal self, not the personal self. So we will see how the word in English and then what's the Sanskrit that you will find in theosophical literature. So the first aspect of the soul is seen as a mediator between the spirit and the body. So the soul is like a bridge. is what brings the universal spirit in touch with the body. And the highest aspect of the soul is what Blavatsky called the spiritual soul. So the spiritual soul is the highest aspect of the soul. Is the aspect that that itself is like a bridge between the spirit and the soul. And the spiritual soul is impersonal. The spiritual soul is the source of all divine attributes, whether we call them love, wisdom, compassion, etc. The spiritual soul is like the manifestation or the reflection of the spirit in the human soul. So this is the highest aspect. Then there is what Blavatsky called the human soul. And the human soul, this is the more individual aspect of the soul. Although the spiritual soul is still impersonal, it's universal, the human soul is the part that we can say my soul. Sometimes it is called the individual soul. This is the aspect of the soul that reincarnates and gathers experiences from each incarnation. The human soul is the source of our sense of I-ness, I am. We feel that we are, that sense of I am comes from this aspect that we call the human soul. And then we have what Blavatsky sometimes called the animal soul. Perhaps today we would say the biological soul or something like that, which is that aspect in ourselves that brings or is the source of our desires, our passions, the force that makes us accomplish things. It is called animal soul because it is in the animal kingdom that this is developed. You see, plants have a certain level of consciousness, but what we know as desire, as all these biological instincts that I was talking about, they are fully developed in the animal kingdom. And then we bring it with us. So part of the animal soul is the tendencies that I was referring to as the desires of the flesh. That would be, seeking pleasure, going away from pain, etc., etc. So all these things are aspects of the soul because these are, let's say, psychological aspects. The spirit is this unity, but then the soul is the source of wisdom, love, and compassion, the first aspect of the soul. Then the human soul is the source of the sense of I-ness and the possibility of thinking, what we call intelligence or rational intelligence. And then the animal soul is the source of our passions and desires, etc. So this is what makes a human being alive in a sense, or with a psychological nature. And the terms that are used are buddhi, manas, and kama, the Sanskrit terms, for you to be familiar, because when you read theosophical literature, you frequently will find this. And then the body also, you see, has three aspects in the theosophical view. The first one is what we could call the physical aspect of the body. It is the atoms and cells and organs that we can perceive with our five senses. But this physical body by itself cannot be alive. There is another principle that is needed, that is what we can call life. Because, for example, if a person for whatever reason, suppose that a body that is perfectly healthy, and by artificial means we make the heart stop, and then that thing that we call life is gone, and then that body, which is perfectly healthy, cannot live as it was living again before, as an entity where all the functions are coordinated and they work all together. What is the difference between the body that was healthy before and the same body that is still healthy. There is nothing wrong with it. It's just that there is no life there. So this life is a principle in the Theosophical view. This life is a principle that is separate, different from the body. When the principle of life is present in the body, then all the cells work together and as one organism, and this serves as a vehicle of consciousness, as a vehicle of expression for the soul. When the life is gone, then all the cells are still as alive as they were before. When a body dies, the cells don't die there. The cells are still very much alive. But this thing that we call life, not being there, what happens is that the cells stop working together. They start working on their own, and eventually the cells begin to die, and that's when the body begins to decompose. So this life is like a kind of energy that brings everything together so that everything works as a single organism. Now, a problem is that this life is not physical. Science doesn't know what life is. When I was in college, and the typical thing that the professors would say is, we don't know what life is. We only know what a living being is, because the living being is one that does this, does that, etc. But then we don't know what life in itself is. So this is a mystery, what life is. But in any case, the idea is that in the Theosophical view, it is a principle that is not material. And how does something not material interact with something that is material, like the physical body? And this is by means of a double. Blavatsky used to call it astral double, like a kind of subtle double of the body. Double because it looks just like the body. It follows, the shape of the body. For those who have certain clairvoyance, they see it looks just exactly as the body, but it's of a subtle nature. Later in Theosophical literature, because the word astral was a little confusing, they started calling it etheric double. Again, etheric has been made of a subtle matter. But the idea is that this matter of which the double is made of is physical enough to affect the physical body and non-physical enough to be affected by life. So it works as a kind of bridge between the immaterial life and the physical body. So here we have these 7 principles. If we want to see the Sanskrit names are prana for life. This prana is a word that is quite well known today. Then linga sharira for the ethereal double, and then stula sharira for the physical. These last 2 are not so commonly used in Theosophical literature any longer. But in any case, we can see here the 7-fold constitution of human beings according to Theosophical teachings. And we can see how they are arranged. They can be arranged in spirit, soul, and body. So now we are ready to see this question of the higher and lower nature. The idea is that the 2 higher principles, Atma and Buddhi, the spirit and the spiritual soul, plus the highest aspect of manas, the highest aspect of the human soul, this constitutes what we call the individuality, which is that which is relatively permanent in us. I mean relatively permanent because it is said that as long as the human evolution lasts, these 3 principles, Atma, Buddhi, and Manas, are always behind every personality that incarnates or that is born. And the higher aspect of Manas is the part that retains all the experiences in the different reincarnations, and therefore it lasts throughout all the reincarnations. And then the lower aspect, the four lower principles from karma to the physical body, plus the lower aspect of manas, what we called our mind, they constitute the personality, which is transient, which is impermanent. We get a new personality, or the soul gets a new personality in each new incarnation. So when we die, first the physical body disappears. Well, first life leaves the physical body, then the physical body dissolves, then the etheric double dissolves, and then consciousness is positioned at the level of the animal soul, the passions and desires. Then that dissolves and the consciousness is positioned at the level of the lower part of manas, our mind, what we call our mind. And then eventually that dissolves and then consciousness stays in the highest aspect of the soul, which assimilates all that the personality, all the personal experiences. And in the new incarnation, a new mind is formed, a new set of emotions, and a new body is formed. So all that is new in each incarnation, and that's why it is transitory. When it is said that the higher has to, subjugate, to use HPV's word, the lower nature, are we referring to the mind, the lower aspect of manas, to the emotions, the passions, the desires? Are we also referring to life, to the ethereal double, and to the physical body? And yes, technically speaking, I would say that what is necessary to subjugate, let us use that word, then we will see how we can interpret that word. But it would be the psychological aspect, meaning the mind and the emotions, mainly because the body is passive in relation to the mind. Passive in what way? Blavatsky says the body does have its own tendencies, but those tendencies are impressed there by the mind and the emotions. Many times you may notice that at some point you realize that you want to change, you want to make a physical change in your life. I don't know, your sleeping routine, your eating routine, your exercise routine, whatever it is. And maybe the whole of your mind and emotions agree with this, but then you can see that there is a resistance at the level of the body. The body wants to keep doing what it was used to do. So we could say that the body also needs to be subjugated in that sense. But as Blavatsky said, all those impressions or tendencies that are in the body were first impressed by our minds and emotions. So now we have to deal with the previous impressions that we put on the body. The mind may change very fast, but the body, because the body is more material, it has more inertia. It needs a longer time to change. If we force the body, too strongly, then it may be unhealthy for the body. So we may change our minds and say, I don't want to do this any longer. But then the body will keep on going in that direction until after a while, the mind and the emotions impress the new direction in the body. At some point in the process of yoga, there is the need to begin to control prana and to direct it in specific ways to produce certain specific changes especially in the etheric double, which is where the chakras are, for example. So perhaps we could say that's part of the subjugation. But yes, at the level of the practice and the practice that we in general engage, is mainly focused, this subjugation, on the psychological aspect. If we change our perspective, if we change our mind and emotions, then the rest follows that change in our mind. So basically we have here this idea of the higher nature, which is the universal self, of which we are an expression, or rather we could say we are the universal self, and our personal self is an expression of us as the universal self. Then the source of wisdom and love and compassion, which is buddhi, and then the pure mind, the higher mind with a pure sense of I amness, I exist, not I exist as this, therefore I'm separate from that. It's just the awareness of being. That is the higher nature. And then the lower nature is all the rest. Blavatsky, remember, let's go back to what she said. She said that the only inflexible rule has been ever binding upon the neophyte, and as it is binding now, and it is the complete subjugation of the lower nature by the higher. So what this means is that the lower nature, what we can call the lower mind, the emotions, and the physical body itself, they all have a role. The role is to preserve the physical expression that the soul needs to use. So what we call the lower mind is that self-centered mind that is taking care of or that is paying attention to take care of the body, and not only the body but also the psychological ego that is generated by the mind and the emotions. And its role is just to preserve our person, So the tendency of the mind and the emotions is to be very personal. If you attack me, I will attack you. If there is something to be gained, I will try to gain it. I don't care if you lose, because it's like the lower nature is interested in self-preservation, and that is necessary. And that is necessary because the soul needs the body to survive. But the problem is that in the process of evolution, at some point, the preservation of the body and the personality begin to take over, to become disproportionate. So that is me over everybody else. So the subjugation means that now we begin to live in our bodies, in our emotions, in our minds, but from the perspective of the higher. So now I start looking at the common good. I start working for what is needed, more globally. Of course, if we are going to be helping in the common good, I need to have a healthy body. So I will take care of my body, but not because my body is more important than anybody else's, simply because it's just the right thing to do. If I don't take care of my body, then my soul stops being able to express on the physical plane. The same with the emotions and the mind. It's necessary to take care to some extent of our emotional nature, of our mental nature, but simply because we start recognizing these are vehicles of expression. They need certain amount of care because all vehicles of expression are limited and they do need some care. But I take care of them not because I feel these are more important than anybody else's, but just because, well, this is my duty. I take care of these vehicles so that I as a soul can have the experience on the physical plane that is needed. So from a certain point of view, we can start here, and then we will see as we go on in the webinar. We could say that subjugation of the higher, of the lower by the higher, means a change in perspective. It doesn't mean, to be in a war with ourselves, to be a bully of the lower nature. All those things are things that happen, are tools or actions that are available to the lower nature. The higher nature doesn't have that kind of aggression or competition or this idea of war. Let us go into a war with the lower nature, although many times it is felt in that way and it is described in spiritual literature in that way, we will see that if the higher nature, or when the higher nature enters into activity, this process of subjugation is one that is not aggressive, that is not a war of wills, but is one that happens naturally because of wisdom, because of love, because of compassion, which are the qualities of the higher nature. So we will see all of this in different examples that Blavatsky talks about. The idea is that there are two things in our lower nature, let's say. One is the body itself, and that body may have tendencies that are selfish or may not have those tendencies. Therefore, the body is neutral. It's not pushing you too strongly for self-preservation. There is a natural instinct of self-preservation in the body, but in the Theosophical view, on top of that thing that is natural, we have what are called, or we gather, let's say, some tendencies which are called elementals in Theosophical literature, that increases that natural tendency and now makes the body very selfish or out of equilibrium. For example, we see in animals that the pleasure and pain is a guide for them, but they don't have this tendency to try to maximize pleasure. In our cases, we have the tendency to, go towards pleasure and go away from pain, but then we have an added element that tries to maximize this. So we start overdoing things that are pleasurable. We start overdoing them just to get the pleasure that comes out of it. And eventually we make the body sick. This is something that, this is because we have this added energy, this elemental energy that is increasing that tendency. So part of the spiritual path, as we are going to see, implies a certain purification. The same can be said at the emotional level and at the mental level. The way we can see it from the point of view of energies is that we have to get rid of these energies that bring the body, the emotions, and the mind out of a state of equilibrium. When that happens, for example, Blavatsky, or maybe more precisely Besant, would say, if you see clairvoyantly the body of an enlightened being, you see that the emotions are quiet, the mind is quiet, the body is quiet, and they respond only to the impulses that come from the soul. So when the soul needs to make the body or the emotions or the mind respond, they respond right away and in a precise way, following the impulses that come from the soul. But she says, when you see a normal human being, the aura is in constant movement. It has a motion that is not coming from the soul. It is a motion that is intrinsic in our aura and is caused by these elementals. So when the soul is trying to influence the mind and the emotions or the physical body, it's very difficult for the soul because there is too much noise, because our bodies are more used to responding to the elemental energies than responding to the soul. So there has to be this purification of this artificial movement in our bodies, and then our bodies become really a vehicle for the soul. So in that way, we could say that is changing the vibration. Now, how do we do this? We will see in the webinar different aspects of the work, but there is something that is, I think, essential, and this is what Blavatsky begins with. First, she says that in this work of subjugating the lower, there is a stage in which all this is experienced with a certain level of suffering. And we will see why, and we will see how that can be minimized. She says, from the Vedas to the Upanishads, and these are Hindu sacred literature, to the recently published Light on the Path, this is a theosophical book published during Blavatsky's time, we find but one only way, hard, painful, troublesome, by which a person can gain the true spiritual insight. So if you see, Blavatsky always had this tendency. Actually, I read once a story that the master kind of scolded her because she's not there to sell you, as it happens in modern spirituality many times. Oh, be spiritual, that everything will be easier, better. You know, if you are a good person, God will reward you with all these treasures and will bless your life. You know, when you work in that with that idea, what happens is that the personal ego says, sure, I want to be spiritual because I want pleasure, I want happiness, I want joy. So it's easy to fall into the traps of just exchanging. First you thought that having more cars was going to make you happy, and now somebody tells you, no, having more virtues will make you happy, and then you do it because you are just pursuing your personal happiness, which is natural. That's where we all start. But then if there are no warnings about this, we may spend all our lives in activities that seem to be, that we think are spiritual, and it's just another way of feeding our personal ego. So I think this is partly why Blavatsky makes emphasis or puts emphasis on the difficulties of the spiritual path. It is a way of saying, because she says it in some articles, a person that is on the spiritual path, if that person is really mature to be on the spiritual path, that person is there because that person cannot be anywhere else. It's not a choice, okay, I'm going to be spiritual rather than mundane because I like what spirituality promises me. It's just that one cannot be any longer the other way, and then there is no other way to go. So for that person, whatever the path is the only choice. And I think she was trying to filter out, in a certain sense, this idea of, you know, whoever is earnest and serious about the spiritual path has to come to it not seeking a reward. At the same time that the Theosophical Society was being founded, there was the what eventually produced the New Thought movement, that at the time they called it like mental science or Christian Science, and it was based on, you know, using your mind and the power of the mind to have a healthier body, to have, you know, to be happier, to give, which is the foundation of, you know, to a large extent of the New Age. And I think Blavatsky wanted to differentiate this path from that approach. That is one aspect of this. The other aspect is that, yes, we experience this, at least during the transitional phases. We do experience that when we are transitioning from one way of life into the other, we start noticing that now there is more conflict inside of me. Before I would do things and I didn't care and everything was okay. But the moment I want to change, then I start producing an inner conflict. And then I will say, as I heard many people saying, why would I want to be spiritual if now I'm less happy than before? So what Blavatsky is saying here is that when we start going into the direction of spirituality, there is a work to be done, and part of the experience will be that this is a hard work. Now, we can go beyond the conflict as soon as possible if we can approach spirituality in, you know, in the right way, in quotation marks. And Blavatsky will talk about this. How do we, you know, reduce this conflict, this experience of conflict? So she says there is only one way, hard, painful, troublesome, by which a person can gain the true spiritual insight. In her view, difficulties are not negative. They are not something that we should shun away. These are things that will produce true spiritual insight. And we will see why. And then she says the true adept, or this is how she referred to what perhaps today most people would refer to as an enlightened being. But let's say the true adept, the developed human being, must, we are always told, become, he cannot be made. This is something that she repeated many times, meaning that we cannot expect to be granted spiritual maturity and growth. This is something that we have to go through the experiences, and it's something that nobody can give us. The guru can point out the way, but we have to walk that way. There are no external saviors in this approach. And then she says the process is therefore one of growth through evolution, and this must necessarily involve a certain amount of pain. A certain amount of pain is unavoidable. Now, again, as I keep saying, if we face this intelligently, we can reduce that. It is the same, as, I don't know, the adolescence or the teen years. There is there a certain amount of pain. Now, depending on the attitude of the person, of the teenager, how traumatic that period is, or how relatively easy that person can go through that. And we will see also why growth involves a certain amount of suffering. Now, the idea is that if we really see the truth, or as we see the truth, as we see the reality, then we stop valuing things in connection to how pleasant or painful they may be. Like, for example, if somebody is forcing us to do something, to, I don't know, learn a language, a second language, and we don't like it, we will be focused on the annoyance that produces. But if we really want to do it, of course, that will imply a certain level of effort, of putting time, of frustration, of, which we could call suffering. We are talking philosophically speaking when we say suffering or pain. But if we really think that this is important, we just do it. And yeah, sure, the effort, the frustration, the friction that may come with the process is just part of the process. We are not constantly resisting to that, because we see the value of this. So anything in life that is worth doing implies a certain amount of suffering, philosophically speaking. Same with the spiritual path. Non-growth also involves pain. And yes, that is also true. I always say, because some people sometimes complain, that, well, I'm trying to be spiritual and it's harder than before when I was just normal. And I always say, you will suffer no matter what, because you will also have pleasure. I'm not trying to give a negative view of life, but suffering is part of life, no matter what, no matter if you lead a materialistic life or you try to lead a spiritual life. Now, the suffering of a person that is not trying to grow doesn't produce much of a harvest as the suffering in a person that is trying to grow. The suffering in a person that is trying to grow produces blessings, far more blessings, than the suffering of a person that is just, blindly just bouncing off life and the constraints of life. So sure, pain is part of life. When we try to use it intelligently, then it becomes a blessing in disguise. As it is always say, it is a teacher. Okay, so this is where Blavatsky starts now. So why do we suffer? She says, the main cause of pain lies in our perpetually seeking the permanent in the impermanent, and not only seeking, but acting as if we had already found the unchangeable, in a world of which the one certain quality we can predicate is constant change. And always, just as we fancy we have taken a firm hold upon the permanent, it changes within our very grasp and pain results. So you see that this pain that Blavatsky talks about is a psychological pain. It's a pain that is the result of something that we do, that thing that we are doing is producing the pain. If we wouldn't do that, there would be no pain. So it's a self-inflicted pain in a sense. So she says that the main cause of pain is the constantly seeking the permanent in that which is impermanent. This is a very deep philosophical topic, and part of the exercise this week will be working on this in particular. But the idea is that we are trying to, when we acquire things, when we acquire positions, relationships, objects, we are always trying to make the external world be molded in a way that will make us happy, that will be pleasant for us. And the experience of all human beings is that we just cannot manipulate life. Things always happen. Things keep changing. Unintended results appear. So it's like we are wrestling with something that is constantly changing, and we are trying to keep it without changing. And in that attempt, pain, suffering, frustration ensues. This is something that the Stoics understood, quite deeply, and they understood that if your happiness depends on anything that is external, then there is the seed of pain, because the external one day will agree with you, the next day it will not. But if you can find whatever is really permanent, whatever doesn't change, then you are beyond suffering. Then that is the true happiness, which is what we are going to explore today. So, for example, I think that at the root of this is we are enslaved by pleasure and pain. For us, pleasure and pain are tremendously important. And so what we do is we try to maintain a state of pleasure permanently. And that is simply not possible. And if it were, it would just kill the body. Constant pain or constant pleasure would kill the body. So there is nothing wrong with pleasure as long as we can accept also the pain. There is nothing wrong with pleasure as long as we can let it go. So if we are eating some food that is very flavorful and pleasant, there is nothing wrong with that. The problem is that we get attached to the experience of pleasure, so that we want to eat more, or so that we can repeat it later. Or the same with a person. We may enjoy very much being with a person, and there is nothing wrong with that. But if our happiness depends on being with the person, then when the person is not there, we will suffer, or we will be jealous, or this or that. And like that, we can put a lot of examples. The pleasure in itself, there is nothing wrong with pleasure. What is wrong, or what is a cause of suffering, is trying to make pleasure, or the situation that produces pleasure, permanent, because it will not be. And so we can call that attachment or clinging. So what we have to see, and this is what we are going to see today, what we have to seek is not to avoid pleasure. It's not to try to stay in some insensitive state where we don't feel pleasure or pain. What we have to learn is to experience both without clinging to them. And for that, what can help us is little by little discover that which is permanent in us. Because if our consciousness lives always at the level of pleasure, pain, that is constantly changing, we get exhausted. It's like we are tossed about by the I don't know, the waves in the ocean. But if we can find that point in ourselves that is quiet, that is permanent, then we can experience pleasure and pain, but we are in a position of equilibrium. So finding this place is very important. But how do we find this place? And this is what we are going to explore in the last part of the meeting. Pain and pleasure are part of nature, are part of life. If your goal is not to feel pain, then you will be attached to pleasure, and because pleasure cannot be permanent, you will feel pain. When pleasure and pain stop being so important, and this is something that can happen, the problem is that when all our reality, when our consciousness is made of pain and pleasure, so to say, then it seems that there is no other option. But as we begin to find that we exist beyond the level of pleasure and pain, then pleasure and pain become far more relative, become external experiences which we are okay with. Of course, if you, I don't know, if you ask me, I would prefer pleasure, but when pain is there, it's fine, it's part of life, it's not a big deal. Of course, we are talking in general. There is always situations in life which we perceive perhaps too painful, and then a reaction to the pain happens in us. This is something that we normally grow gradually into. But little by little, pleasure and pain they are experienced, and we are okay with both. We are not touched in our core by pleasure or pain. The idea is to be okay with whatever comes. Both pleasure and pain will come. As long as we are incarnated, there is the physical plane is a plane of duality. There will be pain and there will be pleasure. There is pain and pleasure for the yogi, for the enlightened being, for the master, but they live in a state in which those things are insignificant. You know, if you see in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, or in the Hindu texts, they don't tell you that the yogi is one in which there is no pain. They tell you a yogi is a person who is indifferent to pain and pleasure. Not a person that doesn't feel pain or pleasure. It's a person that doesn't change in the face of pain and pleasure. Indifferent in the sense of not being different. So pain and pleasure will be there, but they lost their sway on you. In modern spirituality, because I think the modern spirituality many times is still materialistic, we think that the spiritual life is a life of no pain. And at least from the Theosophical point of view and from the ancient traditions, that is not the case. And pursuing that goal will only be a source of suffering. And I think that's why Blavatsky starts right away with the idea that suffering is part of the path. It is inevitable. In avoiding suffering is not the path. So let us see a little what Dr. Taibni says about this question of seeking the permanent in the impermanent. Dr. Taibni talks about viveka. This is a Sanskrit word that is the discrimination between the real and the unreal, between the things of permanent value and those of passing interest. In Hinduism, the typical definition of the real is that which is immutable, and unreal, that which is mutable. So you can see it in Patanjali, in Shankaracharya, that is a typical definition of the real and the unreal. And viveka is the ability to discern between the things. This that I'm pursuing is impermanent. So if I pursue it with the idea that this is going to give me happiness, which in all of us means a permanent state of, joy, then this is a problem. Then I am in a state of ignorance or illusion. It's not that, for example, okay, my career is something impermanent, I should not pursue it. Well, if you're pursuing your career because you think that will make you permanently happy, then yes, you should not do it, because it's not going to make you permanently happy. Now, if you understand that no, happiness won't come from this. Good moments will come, difficult moments will come from this, but it's worth doing for whatever other reason. Maybe, well, I need to this to earn a living, or to help in the world, or to whatever the reason, then it's perfectly fine. We live among the impermanent. That is fine. The problem is when we expect the impermanent to be a source of permanent happiness. So he says that Viveka is that faculty of realizing these things. And he says this is not a mere process of thinking, but an illuminated state of the mind, in which it is aware of the great problems of life and the illusions which are inherent in ordinary human life. So this discrimination that we talk about is not merely, as he says, thinking about it. Thinking about it may be the first step. This is how we start considering all these things. But the real Viveka is a wisdom that comes from the overall spiritual practice, of which thinking or meditating on this is only a part. So the real Viveka is this wisdom by which we realize, we see this is not the correct direction. We see what we start doing. We see what our expectations are. It's a state of awareness. In the theosophical literature, in general, there isn't this distinction between physical pain or psychological suffering. We could make that distinction, but normally I haven't seen, theosophists make that distinction. So yes, you can adapt it, whether if we are referring to a physical aspect, then it would be pain, or to a psychological aspect, it would be suffering. So Dr. Taimni says the worldly person is so immersed in the interest pertaining to his outer life that he does not get time even to think about the real problems of life. When a person takes to the path of yoga, to the spiritual path, let's say, as a result of the dawning of Viveka, if we are seeking that, then some wisdom within us is already awakened that says something is missing. So this is the dawning of wisdom. So as a result of the dawning of Viveka and our becoming alive to the illusions of life, the momentum of the past is still behind him, and it is not so easy to shut out the interest of the worldly life suddenly and completely. So he's talking here about this period of transition. Part of us begin to see that this is valuable, the spiritual life, let's say. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden then we lose our, desire for other things, we lose completely our illusions, or we stay in this like double consciousness in which on one hand I realize that this is right, on the other hand I'm still caught in the old habits, and this is something absolutely normal. So this hankering after the objects of the world still continued to trouble him and cause serious distraction in his mind. So this is one of the reasons why there is suffering when we try to work in the spiritual path, because we are changing our direction. It's like there is a car that is moving in one direction. Suppose that there are no brakes. If you want to stop the cars by, holding the car, there will be some friction because there is an inertia going there, and you will have to hold it, and there is a lot of effort and friction until the car stops. And then once that stops, the friction is over. So here we have like a psychological inertia. And now that we are trying to change the direction, there is some friction inevitably. And this is the source of suffering or inner conflict when we start trying to lead a spiritual life. Of course, he says, all depends upon the reality of the viveka, of this discerning, of this wisdom. If we really see the illusions which are inherent in the pursuit of worldly objects like wealth, honor, name, etc., if we really see that this is an illusion, then we lose all attraction for them and naturally give up their pursuit. But if the viveka is not real, if it is the result of mere thinking, then there is constant struggle between the desires which drag the mind outside and the will of the person, the spiritual person, he's putting it in the context of yoga, who tries to make the mind dive within. This in particular for meditation, but this is applicable to anything in life. So you see, whenever we see clearly, then there is no conflict there. The seeing of something clearly makes the illusion disappear. It is truth that will set you free, Jesus would say. If you see the truth of something, then that dissolves the illusion. But the problem is that it's not so easy to see the truth of something. Normally, we begin by understanding conceptually the truth of something. I should not do this. I understand that this is unhealthy, or I understand that this is wrong. But the mind understanding something is just the first little step. I mean, without the mind understanding, then there are very little possibilities of change, unless the person is devotional and the mind doesn't understand, but there is a strong sense of surrender, and then that would work. But in general, in our society, that is more rare. We are such an intellectual society or culture. So it is necessary for the mind to begin to understand. But that is not enough to produce a change. So then there are all these inner conflicts. We understand that this is what I should do, but I haven't seen with the spiritual perception the illusions of something. And therefore, in me, I have the two tendencies that get in conflict. And this, again, is the source of suffering, as Blavatsky was saying. We keep clinging to the impermanent, even if we know that this is impermanent and I shouldn't do it. So he says, the first result of this realization, when wisdom begins to dawn, is fear. This happens to many people. Maybe you are past this particular stage, or maybe you are not. This is just a process that we all have to go through. And he says, the very ground from under our feet seems to be cut away. People and objects around us, which appeared so real, become mere phantoms in the panorama which is passing before us. We seem to be standing in a void, and the horror of loneliness unspeakable engulfs us. And this is similar to the adolescence. That is a stage in which we are losing all the things that made us happy before. We thought our toys, were great, and this kind of relationship with our parents and this kind of activities. And now, because we mature a little, we don't find happiness in that any longer. And for a long time, we try to regain that happiness and keep doing that, but we just cannot be happy doing those things that we did as a child. So similarly, when this wisdom begins to appear little by little, all these things that were so important, my social position and my name and this or that, now when we start losing that, we feel that we are disappearing. Now what? We may feel that we are in a void. We may feel that then what life is not worth, nothing is worth doing because things are just not real. So this is a stage that people go through. Some may go deeper through it, some less, more superficially. This is what St. John of the Cross would describe as the night of the senses. Not the dark night of the soul is something deeper. This is the dark night of the senses, when the person begins to discover that anything that comes through the senses is not really as valuable as we thought it was. So you have to be ready, understand that this is part of the process, and don't be afraid. Trust that this is a momentary experience or situation, and you will get past it. You just go along with this without despairing. Because he says, what do we do when this realization comes to us? We generally get alarmed, terrified, and try to shut it out again by plunging into the activities and interests of the worldly life. Even though we theoretically continue to believe in the unreality of the things around us. But if we do not try to smother this vision and face it squarely, take to the self-discipline prescribed in yoga, then sooner or later, beneath this fast-flowing stream of phenomena, we begin first to sense and later to discern something which is abiding, which transcends change and gives us an eternal foothold. So this is what we go through in different stages. When we start seeing that our thoughts and emotions are fleeting, at the beginning we say, so who am I? But if we persist, little by little we begin to discover something that is eternal, that is abiding, as he says, that is immutable. But before we can perceive the permanent, we have to let go of the impermanent. We have to see that the impermanent is impermanent. And that period will bring some kind of distress or suffering or pain or however you want to call it. But if we, knowing that this is natural, if we persist, then we find something that is far deeper and far more satisfying than the satisfaction that we could find in whatever is always changing. Sometimes this is called the desert of cosmic consciousness. Yes, I like in this movie, The Matrix, one of my favorite phrases is when, you know, the guy that is like the guru says, welcome to the desert of the real. When we start seeing, it would be the unreal, you know, but when we start seeing the unreal, it seems that the world loses its allurement and it feels like we are in a desert. All right, so let us stop here. Thank you everybody for being here.